Chapter 4, Nonverbal Communication. So, most experts agree that 70 to 93% of all communication is nonverbal. So think about that for a second. Think about the impact that nonverbal communication has in our everyday interactions. And when you think about the amount of communication that is sent and received that is nonverbal, that really tells us how aware we need to be of one, our nonverbal communication and how we are communicating to others nonverbally, but also that we are aware of the need to receive and interpret nonverbal communication sent from others. So nonverbal communication is a process of generating meaning using behavior or other than words. It operates side by side with verbal communication, and it's a part of the same system. A part of nonverbal communication that we don't often think about is paralanguage. Paralanguage is the vocalized but not verbal part of a spoken message. So it's the way we say a word, not necessarily the word in itself. So it's our speaking rate, our volume, our pitch, our tone of voice. And we know that the tone and the way we communicate a message can drastically change the meaning. So there's 4 principles of nonverbal communication that we're going to talk about. The first is that it conveys important interpersonal and emotional messages. So many times, if our verbal message is communicating something, our nonverbal message will sometimes ease up with the truth of the message. It'll also really show the impact of how we're feeling about something. So there's a large emotional content to the nonverbal messages that we're sending. And it has a really big interpersonal component to it. So think about this. The more you know someone, the more aware and knowledgeable and factual you're going to be when you interpret their nonverbal communication. So the people that know us best are going to read our nonverbal communication more accurately than those that maybe we don't know. So it has a really big interpersonal component. It's more involuntary than verbal. So sometimes there's those times where we ask someone, are they okay? And they say, oh yeah, I'm doing okay. But you hear the tone of their voice, you see how they're holding their head, you look at their posture, you can tell they're not okay. And so those are things that sometimes we can't hide. If you're like me, my facial expressions get me in trouble fairly often. That was the only benefit of wearing masks the past year or so, was that I didn't get in as much trouble with my facial expressions, but sometimes it happens before I even realize it. And my face tells exactly what I'm thinking. And some of you may have the same challenge that I do, where that's an involuntary thing that happens. It's more ambiguous, so it's more vague. So there's not a true, we talked about language, and language has symbols and language has a code. There's not necessarily a true universal language for a nonverbal communication. The same message or gesture can have multiple meanings. So for instance, if you're talking to someone and they cross their arms, it could mean that they're upset with you, or it could just mean that they're cold. So it's kind of an ambiguous, and it's something that's up for interpretation. And so in order to be an effective communicator, you need to look at all the things surrounding the nonverbal, the content, the context. All of those things help clarify a message that can be seen as ambiguous. Nonverbal is more credible than verbal. And like we talked about a moment ago, it's involuntary. So sometimes that if we're not telling the truth, we're maybe trying to hide how we feel about something, our nonverbal communication will reveal the truth. And so you can trust nonverbal typically more than you can trust a verbal message. So functions of nonverbal communication: nonverbal conveys meaning, it influences others, it helps regulate conversation flow. So think about times when you've been stuck in a conversation that you really wanted out of, how your nonverbal communication really help to indicate that you are ready to be out of the conversation. Sometimes that's the way we nod. Sometimes that's the way we move away from people. We kind of back out of the room. We try to transition the topic. Those are some things that we do to regulate conversation flow through nonverbal. It affects relationships. So as we talked about earlier, there's definitely a relational element to nonverbal communication. And those people that know us best will interpret our nonverbal more accurately. But it also has a relational element. You can communicate liking or approval through nonverbal communication many times by smiling or nodding, making eye contact. Those are things that we do that affects the relational element and communicates liking or pleasure within a relationship and an interaction. It expresses our identities. I think something we don't often think about are artifacts and objects and possessions that we have, those things that surround us. They communicate a message about us. They communicate your interests, they communicate your personal style, your personal identity. So when we make choices about the clothes we wear, the way we decorate our homes, all of those things communicate nonverbally things about us. So there's types of nonverbal communication. Kinesics is movement and refers to the study of hand, arm, body, and face movements. So gestures that you make within your presentations or should be purposeful. That's the first thing. When you're thinking about presentations, the gestures you make should have a purpose. In everyday language, we know that our gestures have a role sometimes where we don't realize. So gestures are, first of all, we have adapters. Those are touching behaviors and movements that indicate internal states, typically related to arousal or anxiety. So probably some of you are thinking, oh, I know when I'm anxious, I do this. I fidget with my hands, I twirl my hair, I touch my face a lot, I put my hands in my pockets. Those are things that we do. Other times when we're in conversations, maybe we're talking to someone that is anxious and upset, and so we find ourselves touching their arm. Those are just kind of things that we do to adapt within the communication interactions. Emblems are gestures that have a specific agreed upon meaning. So think about like a thumbs up or an okay symbol. That's something that has an agreed upon meaning, at least within our culture and country. We'll talk more about differences within across cultures in a minute. Illustrators are gestures that are used to illustrate the verbal message they accompany. So think about if you caught a fish and it was really big. So when you're telling the story, you hold your hands apart to really show how big the fish is. That's an illustrator. We know that we use head movements and posture. That really helps to emphasize our message with our audience and in communication interactions in our interpersonal life. We know that nodding can help reinforce the communication and is a good form of nonverbal communication to indicate liking. We also know the impact that posture can have on just kind of indicating to someone that we're interested or we're involved or maybe we're withdrawn and not involved in the communication. Oculesics is the branch of nonverbal that focuses on eye contact. So regulation, functions of eye contact are regulate interaction, and provide turn taking, monitors communication by receiving nonverbal communication from others. So when we're talking and we're looking at other people, then we're able to receive the nonverbal communication they're sending back to us. It signals cognitive activity. So sometimes if we're thinking and we look away to really process that information, when we look away, it kind of is like, okay, I need a minute to get my thoughts. It expresses engagement. When we're listening to someone and we're listening intently, looking at them expresses engagement, that we are listening and with them in the communication interaction. It can convey intimidation. I think all of us in our lifetime, maybe by our parents or a teacher or a coach, we've definitely been given eye contact that was done in an intimidating manner, that they really kind of glared us down. I can think about as a child, if I was maybe too fidgety in church, all my mom had to do was give me a look and I knew I better straighten up or it would not be a fun afternoon after church. So we've all experienced those interactions where someone looked at us and it conveyed an intimidation. Eye contact expresses flirtation and it also helps establish a rapport or connection with the people we're communicating with. Facial expressions communicate a range of emotions and can be used to infer personalities traits and make judgments about a speaker's credibility and competence. So it can communicate things from being tired, excited, angry, confused, sad, bored, shy. Just make sure that your facial expressions are communicating an emotion, mood, or personality trait that is appropriate for your audience and what your speech goals are. Your facial expressions should match the content of your speech. For some of us, the facial expression implementation of speeches is very easy. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're animated like me, that may get you in trouble a lot with your facial expressions, but it does make it easy to really emphasize with your face what you're feeling, and that your words are powerful to you. Now, others that may be more stoic and rarely show facial expressions on a regular basis, this is a little harder. And so it's something that you have to kind of work on to make sure that your face is reflecting your involvement and your focus in your presentation and your speech. So haptics are touch. It's the study of communication by touch, and touch can communicate levels of intimacy, and it also communicates levels of power. Vocalics is the study of paralanguage, which is the vocal qualities that go along with verbal messages, such as our pitch, volume, rate, vocal quality, and verbal fillers. It's not necessarily what you say, but it's how you say it. Communication functions of vocalics, it's repetition. So our voice is the way we use our voice repeats what we're saying. It complements what we're saying. It accents what we're saying. Sometimes our nonverbal substitutes for what we're saying. It regulates, but it also can contradict. So if someone says, if you're talking to your boyfriend says to you or your girlfriend, I know we had plans, but something else came up and I'm going to go out with my friends. You're not thrilled, but you say, oh, that's fine. That's just fine. Well, clearly it's not. Your word indicates it's fine. The way you say the word indicates that it's not fine. And so sometimes it can be contradictory. Proxemics is nonverbal communication. So you think of the people in your life and the level of distance that you're comfortable. So we know that I'm someone that I want my space. I don't like people close to me. And so when someone is allowed to sit right by me or be close to me, then that kind of tells that that's a very close relationship. You think about when you go to restaurants and you kind of watch how people sit in a booth or at a table. Do they sit side by side or do they sit across from each other? That kind of thing indicates the level of intimacy within the relationship, but also the level that person is comfortable with. And I think a lot of us have kind of reevaluated this in the past year, with things that have gone on in our world, that maybe we were pretty comfortable with space and now we kind of want a little bit more space than we ever did before. We want to keep that distance. Chronemics is nonverbal communication, and that's how time affects communication. I don't think we really think about this a lot. I don't think we realize the impact that time has on nonverbal communication. When you're going to a face-to-face class and you're late, especially if you're late repeatedly, that's speaking some non-verbally. That's nonverbal communication to your instructor. If you're late for meetings, if you're late for work, that's nonverbal communication. If you used to hang out with a group of friends all the time, and then you started dating someone new, and now all of a sudden that's who you spend your time with, that's nonverbal communication. It's nonverbal communication to your friends that this person has taken a larger role of importance in your life, and it's nonverbal communication to this significant other that they're your focus right now. So time and how we use time is nonverbal communication. Personal presentation. So personal presentation involves two components: our physical characteristics and the artifacts which we adorn and surround ourselves. So the way we present ourselves to the world is nonverbal communication. The way we dress, the way we accessorize, the way we portray ourselves, that is nonverbal communication. Our environment is nonverbal communication. Our appearance is nonverbal communication. So nonverbal competence. There's guidelines for sending nonverbal messages. You need to understand that nonverbal communication is multi-channel. We're receiving nonverbal communication in multiple ways all of the time. Some are easy to interpret. Some are easy to attach meaning to. Others are more ambiguous, and others may conflict with each other. And so our goal is to be aware of the communication that's being sent to us. Nonverbal communication affects our interactions. So the nonverbals that we're conveying and the nonverbals being sent back to us affects our interactions. I'll tell you this. I don't know if you or you may be this kind of person. But I can tell you that sometimes at work, I have coworkers that we may be sitting and talking, and then all of a sudden I look and they're just on their phone, and I think, okay, I think they're clearly done with that this conversation, but they're not. Sometimes I do that. I'm talking with someone, I get a text or an email pops up on my computer, that takes my attention away, and so I was having a really good conversation with the person in my office, but the second my attention went to something else, that affected our interaction. The fact that I allowed myself to be taken away from that interaction impacted the effectiveness of our nonverbal, of our communication interaction. Understand how nonverbal communication creates a rapport. The way you respond to people, both verbally and nonverbally, helps create a relationship and a rapport between you and those that you're interacting with. By looking at people, by nodding at people, by smiling at people, all of those things may seem small, but it really helps to create that relationship. Understand how nonverbal communication regulates our conversation and how it relates to listening. In order to be a good listener, effective nonverbal communication is important. It relates to impression management. So like we talked about earlier, it is our personal presentation, our self-presentation to the world is nonverbal communication. And we need to increase competence in the channels of nonverbal communication so we're aware at how it's being sent to us by others. So do know that nonverbal communication is not clear-cut. It's not as easy to decode as verbal messages. We need to work on increasing our awareness that we're not just listening to the words that people are saying, but we're paying attention to what's going behind the words that they're saying. People watching can help. The more you watch people and the more you kind of study how they communicate nonverbally, that helps hone your skills in your own relationships. Skilled decoders of nonverbal messages are said to have more nonverbal sensitivity. It just makes them more likable and have more social networks. There are certain nonverbal signals that are not related, so just do know that not everything you're seeing nonverbally is related to the communication interaction that you're a part of. You need to make sure that you interpret and read nonverbal cues in context. Don't try to apply more meaning to them than is in existence, and interpret cues within the correct channels. So deception. A lot of us are aware of the fact that when it comes to deception, many times the words you're saying do not indicate deception, but the way you say them does. Many people rely on nonverbal communication more than verbal to determine deception, but there's not a set profile of deceptive behaviors, meaning I may indicate that I'm being deceptive in a different way than you are. Now, it all typically is nonverbal, but it may be different. I tend to talk louder when I'm being not being truthful. Sometimes I talk a little faster. Sometimes I provide way more detail than is necessary in an effort to cover up maybe deception that may be happening. I'm thinking more of my teenage years. But that's how I do it. But I know other people that give very little information. They may kind of get sweaty when they're talking. They may just kind of are unable to communicate the message clearly. They kind of get stuttered and they kind of mess up in their words. So it kind of varies by person. Truth bias leads us to believe that a person is telling the truth, especially if we know and like that person. And I think we've all been guilty of that. If we really know and like someone, even when they're lying to us, we just really want to think they're telling the truth. Nonverbal leakage, which is not my favorite term on earth, refers to nonverbal behaviors that occur as we try to control the cognitive and physical changes that happens during a state of cognitive and physical arousal. So there's times when we don't want our true emotions to be revealed. But no matter how hard we try to control those, it comes out. There's times when maybe my boss comes to me with an idea that I think is a terrible idea, but one of my goals is to be better at listening and thinking through and taking a step back and not jumping to a quick reaction or judgment about things. So in my effort to say, that's an interesting idea, that's an interesting thought, and I'm trying to be supportive, but my boss, who I've known for a good number of years now, says, you hate it, don't you? You think that's a terrible idea. And so, yeah, I do think it's a terrible idea. But that's sometimes that my nonverbal kind of takes over and seeps out. I like that better than leakage. Seeps out and is conveyed when I don't want it to. And that can happen especially when we have strong emotions about a topic. So nonverbal communication in context. We're going to talk about the relational context. Nonverbal communication establishes and maintains relationships. People who are skilled at encoding nonverbal messages have various interpersonal advantages. They can be more popular, they have larger social networks, they have more acquaintances and close friends, and they're less likely to be lonely or socially anxious. Nonverbal communication increases our expressivity, and so people generally find attractive when someone is expressive. They also get more attention. Nonverbal communication helps maintain relationships once they have moved beyond the initial stages of just basic communication. It helps communicate emotions, and it provides social and emotional support. Expressing the need for support is another big part of relational maintenance, and a lot of times that the way that we express our need for support is done nonverbally. People who lack nonverbal encoding skills may send unclear or subtle cues requesting support that are not picked up by others. In the professional context, surveys of current professionals and managers have found that the most report that nonverbal skills are important to their jobs. However, there's no training on nonverbal communication. In professional contexts, managers and mentors with nonverbal decoding skills can exhibit sensitivity to others' nonverbal behavior and better relate to their employees and mentees. Interpreting emotion from nonverbal cues can have interpersonal and professional benefits. So when you're responsive to the people that you work with by expressing yourself nonverbally and indicating to them that you're with them, you're participating in the communication interaction. But in addition to that, you're able to read and take in their nonverbal communication. That's going to help maintain a better relationship in the professional environment. It could also bring positive attention to yourself. Being able to nonverbally encode turn-taking cues can allow people to contribute to conversations at relevant times, and getting an idea or a piece of information or feedback at the right time can help bring attention to your professional competence. In culture, we need to understand that norms for nonverbal communication varies from country to country and among cultures within particular countries. So while some nonverbal signals are universal, like a smile, many vary greatly across countries and cultures. So if you plan to work internationally or travel a great deal abroad, it's very important that you familiarize yourself with the nonverbal communication in other cultures so that we avoid offending people. In an old speech book that I used to teach out of, there was an example of a diplomat in the United States that was sent to Saudi Arabia. And he clearly didn't have a lot of training when it came to nonverbal communication. He was sitting down with a Saudi leader, and they were sitting in a room with two chairs across from each other. And the first thing that the United States diplomat did was cross his legs. And so immediately the Saudi leader got up and left the room. So some of you may already know why that is. When a lot of Middle Eastern cultures, the bottom of our foot is seen as the dirtiest part of our body. So to show that to someone is perceived as an ultimate insult. You would think a diplomat would have been taught that at some point, but I guess he missed that day in diplomat training. We want to make sure that we're very aware. So simple things like an OK symbol, a thumbs up sign, a peace sign, those don't translate well internationally. They have different meanings, and some of those meanings can be very offensive. So it's important that you have a good idea of what's acceptable from culture to culture. Beyond that, we know that things like touch and eye contact and what's acceptable varies from culture to culture. In the United States, we see eye contact as something important. We think it's a sign of respect and that you're being honest and truthful, but we know that in many Asian countries, eye contact is seen as the opposite. It's seen as disrespect, and you don't give direct eye contact if you are if someone's your elder or above you in your station in life. So it is very important to have an idea of the nonverbal communication differences across cultures. So nonverbal communication and gender, and we're going to talk about a few of these. I think it's kind of an interesting topic. With gestures, women use more gestures in regular conversation than do men, but men tend to use larger gestures than women. Men are, however, more likely to use physical adapters like restless foot and hand movements, probably because girls are socialized to avoid such movements because they are not ladylike. Posture, men are likely to lean in during an interaction than are women, and women are more likely to have face-to-face body orientation while interacting than men. Eye contact, in general, women make more eye contact than men. As we learned, women use face-to-face body interaction. That would lead to more sustained eye contact. And women tend to do more looking and get looked at more than men. With facial expression, women reveal emotion through facial expressions more frequently and accurately, and men are more likely than women to exhibit angry facial expressions. With haptics or touch, it's often assumed that men touch women more than women touch men, but this hasn't been consistent in research. Differences in touch and cross-gender interactions are very small. Women do engage in more touching when interacting with the same gender conversational partners than do men, and in general, men tend to read more sexual intent into touch than do women. In our voice, women are socialized to use more vocal variety, which adds to the stereotypes that we're more expressive. Women are more expressive than men. In terms of pitch, women tend more than men to end their sentences with an upward inflection of pitch, which implies a lack of uncertainty, even where there isn't, which I think that's kind of an interesting thing. With proxemics with space, men are implicitly socialized to take up as much space as possible, and women are explicitly socialized to take up less space. In terms of interpersonal distance, research shows that women interact in closer proximity to one another than do men. Men do not respond as well as women in situations involving crowding. High-density environments evoke more negative feelings from men, which can even lead to physical violence in very crowded settings. I think that's kind of interesting. As we know with all of these, there's exceptions to every rule. I would definitely say for me, the space thing is an exception for me. But it's interesting to kind of look at these things and to kind of think about how you feel like you adjust nonverbally or you communicate nonverbally, and does it kind of fit some of these stereotypes that research would indicate, or do you kind of go against it? And I think for most of us, we would say it varies. Some things are pretty stereotypical and other things definitely are not. So I think nonverbal communication is it's an overlooked, but it's a very important part of communication. It's important that we take time to get to know the people that we're communicating with, that we take time to really watch them and listen to what they say. I think about some things that were mentioned earlier in the chapter about loneliness, and that there are some people that are not going to ask for the emotional support that they need. They're not going to verbalize that. But that is communicated with nonverbal communication unintentionally or involuntary. So I think it's important that we as competent communicators, that we really take time to not just listen to what people are telling us, but to watch how they're telling those things to us. We may be the person that picks up on something that someone needs someone to be aware of. We may be a person to ask are you sure everything's okay? Is everything going okay? Just because we've watched them and we feel like there's something going on. And we may be that person that opens a door for someone to ask for help when they just didn't know how to do it. So it's important in all aspects of our lives that we become more competent at nonverbal communication, to contributing that, to expressing nonverbal communication effectively, but also observing those people around us and observing what their needs may be that they're communicating with us nonverbally.